Hello, everyone. I am here today with Rowan Williams, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury and also a scholar. And he lives here in Wales, and he agreed to talk with me today. He came and visited with us during Divine Liturgy here at St. Theodore and St. Teilo Church in Cardiff. And Dr. Williams, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for asking.
So many people may not know, but you have been a scholar of Orthodox Christianity for a long time. In fact, wasn't your doctoral dissertation related to Orthodoxy?
It was indeed, yes. I wrote a doctorate on Vladimir Losky, the great émigré Russian theologian who lived in Paris. And it's been a major interest of mine, not just scholarly, but personal, for, I suppose, nearly 60 years now.
Wow. So why is it? What is it that interested you in our church?
As a matter of fact, the first Orthodox priest I ever met was a Welshman.
All right.
Father Barnabas, Archimandrite Barnabas, who was a convert from Anglicanism and a very remarkable, very charismatic personality who came to celebrate the Divine Liturgy in Swansea when I was a schoolboy. And the curate in our Anglican parish knew that I was interested in exploring my own vocation as a priest. So when I was about 14, he said, well, come along with me and we'll go to the Divine Liturgy. So that was the first time I'd attended a liturgy, the first Orthodox priest I'd spoken to. And it stimulated an ongoing interest. I read Timothy Ware's book on the Orthodox Church, that wonderful little book, which I think for so many people has been a very special introduction.
Right.
And in later years, of course, became very friendly with Metropolitan Kallistos as he became. But yes, I suppose the interest goes back to when I was about 14 or 15.
What can you tell us about, you mentioned Father Barnabas, who I've already heard from a number of people here in Wales, his name on their lips. So what was your sense of him? What was he like?
He was, I think the word is probably a prophetic personality. He wasn't a community founder. He tried to found monastic communities, but they never quite worked. What made the impact was the personality of somebody who was clearly a man of deep prayer, deep integrity and conviction, and also very unpretentious, very simple and austere in his life. And he touched the lives of all sorts of individuals, some of whom found their way into the Orthodox Church and some of whom didn't, but all of whom, I think, retained a very profound veneration for him. And of course, at that time, and we're talking about the 1960s, English-speaking Orthodox clergy were not in great abundance in the UK. Welsh-speaking Orthodox clergy, I think, were down to one, that is Father Barnabas himself. But Father Daniel, whom I think you've met, was, of course, very closely associated with Father Barnabas, and in some ways, something of a spiritual heir of Father Barnabas.
So you know Father Daniel. Would you give your impressions of him? I've already gotten to interview him, but it's always
I gathered
good to get multiple perspectives.
I've known Father Daniel for decades, with enormous affection and respect. And we had some very interesting conversations about his own work in translating the Divine Liturgy into Welsh, when we discussed a little bit what sort of words would be most appropriate for certain prayers there. And Father Daniel's own recording of the Divine Liturgy in the Welsh language is something of a treasure.
Did you, I know that you've done translation yourself from Welsh into English, such as the Taliesin. Did you have conversations about sort of the particularities, the nitty-gritty of moving between those two languages with him?
Well, yes. And I think that was part of the conversation, but also we were thinking about how Welsh words would correspond to Greek or Slavonic words at times. So extra interest there.
Yeah, exactly. You also mentioned knowing Metropolitan Kallistos Ware. He departed this life just, I think, a couple of years ago now. And last year when I was in Oxford, I had the chance to visit his grave briefly. What stories can you share about your relationship with him and about his relationship with the Anglican Church?
One of the things which many of us really valued in Kallistos was that while he'd converted from Anglicanism, he retained a very positive appreciation of, I suppose, those elements in Anglicanism which had helped lead him towards his calling in the Orthodox Church, which meant that there wasn't any kind of embarrassment or awkwardness in being an Anglican in his in his company, in his presence. Though many of us used to tease him a bit about the way in which he would say, of course, we of the East. And we'd say, yes, Westminster School and Magdalen College.
Right.
But yes, I first met him when I was a student, when I was an undergraduate, when he came to give a talk on St. Gregory Palamas in Cambridge in about 1969, I think. And then when I moved over to Oxford to do my research, I saw quite a lot of him. He was my internal examiner for my doctorate.
Oh, wow.
And I still have the 9 pages of notes which he wrote on my thesis, mostly correcting my Greek.
Wow.
But we always kept in touch. And one of the great privileges of my life was to go with him to the Holy Mountain about 10 years ago.
What was that like?
Well, obviously visiting Athos itself was an unforgettable few days, and we were received with enormous generosity and kindness wherever we went. And that had a lot to do with Metropolitan Kallistos, of course. And being there in his company, seeing something of his own reputation, his own impact in his own church, that was a gift. And just spending time in his company. He was still engaged at that time in translating the final volume of the Philokalia, which eventually appeared just after his death.
Right.
So that was a very special memory. But again and again, we found ourselves speaking at the same conferences, sharing platforms, discussing issues. He was, of course, heavily involved in official ecumenical dialogues. He was an official guest at the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops in 2008 when I was Archbishop. So his death was, I think, for me, as for many, a real passing of an era. And again, one of the things I remember most from attending his requiem, his funeral, was the number of ordinary Orthodox parishioners in Oxford who turned up and who knew him essentially as a parish priest and loved him as a parish priest and as a teacher and a father and a pastor of souls in that connection. People saw the scholar, the enormously skilled and sophisticated classical scholar who brought all his Greek learning to bear on the study of the fathers. People remembered him as a lecturer of amazing clarity and simplicity on difficult subjects. But to see him in that light, to see him as someone who had simply been a shepherd of souls in a parish, that moved me deeply.
You know, you mentioned participating in ecumenical dialogues with him, and I'm sure in your time as the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the relationships that you worked on was the relationship with the Orthodox. And
very much.
I mean, it's very clear, of course, there are big theological differences between the Orthodox Church and the Anglican Church. And I know I'm just interested in your sense of that relationship, particularly here in the UK. How would you characterize it?
I think the relationship in the UK has been very cordial for 2 reasons. One is, historically speaking, going back 200 or 300 years, there's always been a strand in the Anglican identity in this country which has said, well, we're inheritors of the whole of the patristic tradition, not just the Latin world. And so a long tradition of real immersion in and scholarship around the Greek fathers. And you can trace that back to the 17th century. You can see it even in, believe it or not, in John Wesley,
right,
who immersed himself in Gregory of Nyssa and the Macarian homilies. You can see it in some strands of the revival in the 19th century in the Anglican Church, where instead of looking only to Rome, people looked very much to the Eastern world. So that's gone on. And in addition to that, I think at some critical moments, for example, during the First World War, the then Archbishop of Canterbury was a very strong defender of Orthodox communities in Eastern Europe in the days of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And many Anglican churches in this country offered hospitality to, particularly in the first instance, Greek and then later Russian emigre communities. So there was that kind of grassroots awareness. And I think if you put that together with the increasing visibility of Orthodox theology in the theological world of the United Kingdom, the fact that the late Metropolitan John Zizoulis was a university teacher in England for quite a long time, all that made for a kind of ease of interaction. And the Orthodox played a very important role in councils of churches locally. So, yes, if you put together figures like Metropolitan Kallistos, Metropolitan John, and of course Metropolitan Anthony in the Russian Church.
Yes.
These were all figures who were contributing enormously to the religious life of the UK overall, to the theological life of the UK. And I think that made for a warmth of interaction, which to some extent spilled over into international ecumenical affairs too.
Right. One of the things that we've noted as we've been on pilgrimage here in Wales for the past few days, of course, many of the pilgrimage sites we've gone to are Anglican sites in terms of who owns and runs the church and so forth. And, for the Orthodox, that there are the relics of saints, that there are places that mark where significant events happen in the lives of the saints of Wales. Speaking for myself, but I think for also other Orthodox, we're grateful that these places are being taken care of, because the Orthodox presence in Wales is very, very small, very, very small. And if it weren't for the Anglican churches, a lot of these places would not exist at all. And I know that in many cases they've brought some of them back, like the Shrine of St. Melangeth, which was almost wiped out, is my understanding.
Yes, well, of course, in Wales, as in the rest of the UK, the Reformation entailed a great deal of vandalism around the sacred sites. And there was a period when St. David's, which is the primary pilgrimage site in Wales, was almost completely neglected at the official level. It's interesting that at the popular level, very often pilgrimages continued almost underground. People still kept the memory of the sites. And so whether it's Penrhyn Melangeth in North Wales or St. David's itself, or the Shrine of Our Lady at Penrhys in the Rhondda Valley, not very far from here, something persisted. And it's fascinating to see some of the customs that survived. Holy wells were still places of pilgrimage, even if their connection with saints wasn't remembered. And very interestingly, the custom survived into modern times, still persists, of a particular kind of Christmas ceremony, a Christmas morning matins before dawn, where people would gather to sing carols, folk carols in Welsh, when it was still dark on Christmas morning in the church. Medieval custom which continued. So yes, I think all that's part of the picture. And speaking for the Anglican Church in Wales as best I can, I think there's a more and more strong sense that we have, I hope by providence, been the custodians of an enormous legacy, which we have often not fully understood, but have attempted to keep open.
How would you describe the Welsh Christian genius? What is it that makes Welsh Christians who they are historically and even now? I mean, you mentioned things that have continued on even from the medieval period.
Always difficult to characterize a whole nation or whole community's Christianity, and I think there are pitfalls, let's say, in ethnic obsessions, as both Anglicans and Orthodox know all too well.
Absolutely.
But if I were to go back, I'd say, first of all, there's the very early generation of Welsh Christianity, where you have the two martyrs of Caerleon, St. Aaron and St. Julius, probably from the 3rd century, maybe the early 4th, most likely the 3rd century. You have the interaction between the church in Western Britain and the church in what's now France, so that some of the monastic influences that come across the Mediterranean from Egypt into the south of France, in Marseille, through St. John Cassian, they affect St. Martin in France. St. Martin has an enormous impact on the monasticism that spreads westward and northward towards Britain. And the great monastery of Lerins off the French coast was a centre where both French and British Christians came together. And one of the great theologians of the 5th century, not terribly well known, but he ought to be, Faustus of Riez. Faustus was abbot of the monastery at Lerins, but he came from Britain. and almost certainly from Western Britain. And the later legends about him make him the son of a royal Welsh family. So the monastic movement coming from Egypt through to Marseille, through to Tours, Lérins, Ireland, and Western Britain, there's a deep monastic streak in Welsh spirituality, and a monastic vision which in Ireland and in Wales, I suppose, is very profoundly attuned to the encounter with God in the natural world, the omnipresence of Christ in the world, the presence of the creative logos in all things. And one quite early Welsh poem simply says, in hills or valleys or out on the deserts of the sea, from Christ there's no escaping. And some of the earliest Welsh language literature is devotional, meditation on themes like that, on the presence of God in Christ in the world, and very early texts from the 9th century or thereabouts, which speak of the poet taking delight in the Paschal celebrations, for example. The catalogue of beautiful things in one early Welsh poem, and one of the beautiful things is the Mass. So that integration of nature and supernature, I think, is part of the picture.
Right. So we've been on pilgrimage for the past few days. We still have a few more days to go. If someone were to come to you and say, okay, I have a week in Wales. What are the places that I must go? What are the great pilgrimage sites of Wales? And maybe even some lesser ones that are still nonetheless very moving.
Well, I mentioned St. David's a moment ago, and of course, that is a very, very distinct, very special place because it's associated with our national saint,
right,
about whom, alas, we know very little except that he was a monastic leader who settled in West Wales, in this rather remote corner of West Wales. We know that he was a great educator in the liturgy, because curiously, the earliest mention just about that we have of him is in an Irish text, which says there were 3 British saints who brought the Mass to Ireland. And they're David and Gildas, the historian, and Gwynno or Finian. So that's part of the legacy of David. But there's something about St. David's, the shrine, or what's left of it, which almost certainly is the site of his tomb, which has been beautifully restored recently.
Yes, we saw it yesterday.
And that remains a very potent site. And of course, not very far from the cathedral, 20 minutes walk from there, is the Holy Well, associated with St. Non,
right,
St. David's mother. So I think, yes, you have to go to St. David's, really. Off the coast of North Wales, the long peninsula at the top of North Wales, the Llyn, just off the coast there is Bardsey Island and Essentially. And that was a place of retreat and solitude for monks from many centuries. We know that there was a community there before the Norman conquest, going right back to these early days in the age of the saints. And I think most people who visit Entley would say, as with St. David's, it has an intensity of quiet and beauty about it, like Iona in Scotland. It has something of that feel to it. And I think, although it's not an easy journey to Entley, because you've got a sea voyage, which can be a bit unreliable in tough weather, it's well worth the visit. And we've talked about Penad Malangell, associated, as you know, with a very charming folk tale of Malangell as a hermit living in the wilds of northeast Wales and protecting a hare that was being hunted by one of the local princes. And she prayed, the hare took refuge in the folds of her habit, and when the prince and his hounds came to get hold of the hare, she prayed and they were frozen to the ground, and the prince was sufficiently impressed to give her a bit of land to settle as a hermit. So Penad Malangell is the site of her shrine, her burial, And there it is still, the old medieval shrine, restored a little bit in this tiny church in the back of beyond. And a reminder again of that curious blend of the natural and the supernatural, the affinity of the saint with a vulnerable creature,
Right.
non-human creature.
Yeah. We're planning on going probably to Cornwall in the next couple of days. And before we started recording, you mentioned that there are connections between this region and that. So a pilgrim in Wales might want to go head on southwest of here.
Very much so. The connections were very intense because although if you sit in London and you look westwards, you think, well, there's Wales, there's Cornwall. But I sometimes say to people, turn the map that way. And what you have is England lying at the bottom, and then a series of promontories pushing out into the sea towards Ireland. You've got bits of Scotland, you've got North Wales, the Bay of Cardiff, you've got South Wales, Southwest Wales, you've got Cornwall, you've got Brittany, not very far away. And all of these communities in the 5th and 6th centuries were deeply interconnected. I've mentioned how monasticism comes from France to Ireland. Many of the saints we read about, like David, clearly thought nothing of travelling by boat between all these places, one promontory to another, around the Irish Sea, as we now call it. So a lot of interchange. There are individuals like St. Samson, who was born in probably southeast Wales, becomes a monk on Caldy Island in southwest Wales, spends time as a missionary in Cornwall, spends time in Ireland, ends up as Bishop of Dol in Brittany in the middle of the 6th century. And we have a fascinating connection with him because we actually have the records of a French Council of Bishops in 550-something, where he's written his signature. And he's written, not just a signature, he's written a little Latin verse.
Oh.
Because we know that he studied with St. Illtyd in southeast Wales, again not very far from here. And St. Illtyd was described as the most refined scholar in the island of Britain at the time. He had this wonderful monastic school at Llyn Fawr, the great church of Illtyd, maybe about half an hour's drive from here, where many of the other saints were trained, and also some of the princes of the Welsh ruling houses at the time. So yes, Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, Brittany, all part of the same world, and St. Brychan, who was the king of a mid-Welsh region, now Breconshire, named after him. Many of his children were associated with the missions of the church. Many became priests and nuns, and they're all over Cornwall. All over Cornwall. So it's it's a family business.
Indeed. So my last question, and I find myself asking this a lot actually now. I've noticed amongst the Welsh saints, there seems to be this kind of almost playfulness in some of the stories about them. And it seems to me that, at least in my impressions over the last week or so, that this is one of the things that kind of characterizes Wales, because these are sort of foundational to Wales's culture and identity. And one of the most prominent images one sees in Wales is a dragon. And I've already heard the story about the red and the white dragon and so forth. How would you describe the importance of the dragon or dragons to the Welsh cultural consciousness?
That's an interesting question. Some people have said to me, it's rather a shame we have as a national emblem something which tends to crop up in scripture as an image of the diabolical.
Right.
But I think there's something very different going on. I think so many legends, some St. Samson, saints who tame chaotic powers, dragons and sea serpents and the like. And I just wonder if there's something about that in it. Here's a formidable force of nature, like the dragon of mythology. But here's that dragon symbolizing a community of profound mutual commitment and we hope charity, defending not the powerful, but the vulnerable. And maybe something of that gets into this mix somehow. I don't know. That's a guess.
I like that take. Well, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Father. It's been a pleasure.
It's a great honor, truly. And thank you for your relationship and your friendship with the Orthodox over the years, for your scholarship.
Well, the debt is all mine.
Thank you.